You probably read the headlines and assume this was just another tech regulation fight, another clash between Ottawa and Silicon Valley, but that surface take misses what really happened. What Canada just did was not a minor adjustment, not a symbolic move, not a political flex for domestic applause. It was a decision about structure and control. And once you see it that way, the reaction inside American tech circles makes sense. The tension, the unease, the sudden concern all become clear. For years, we were told the digital economy had erased borders. Data moves freely. Innovation belongs to whoever moves fastest. Rules only slow things down. Governments should step aside. That story sounded modern and unavoidable, but it quietly served a familiar function. It centralized power. It allowed a small number of corporations, mostly based in the United States, to decide where data sits, who can use it, and which legal system ultimately governs it. Canada existed inside that arrangement for a long time, like most countries. It was told this was simply the cost of participating in the future. What officially happened sounds simple. The Canadian government expanded its sovereign AI compute strategy, directing public funds toward domestic data centers, Canadian-controlled cloud systems, and homegrown artificial intelligence companies. Access comes with rules. Data generated in Canada stays under Canadian law. Critical AI workloads are no longer automatically routed to foreign hyperscalers. If global tech firms want access, they operate under Canadian oversight, Canadian privacy rules, and Canadian accountability standards. That is the part most people were meant to focus on: investment, innovation, jobs. But that framing misses the deeper shift because the real issue is not servers or contracts. The real issue is legal authority over data in an era where data is the core input of economic power. Under U.S. law, American authorities can demand access to data held by U.S. companies, even when that data sits outside the country. Other governments have long been uncomfortable with that reality, especially democracies that claim to value privacy and sovereignty. Canada decided it no longer wanted to live with that tension. This move did not appear out of thin air. It grew out of pressure. When trade conflicts escalate, when tariffs become leverage, when digital taxes are treated as aggression, countries learn a lesson. Dependence creates exposure. If health records, energy models, transit systems, and public research all run through infrastructure governed elsewhere, then full economic control is an illusion. You are leasing your future. Look at who benefited from the old setup and the pattern sharpens. Large platform firms gained scale, data concentration, and legal reach. Financial markets rewarded that dominance. Governments hosting those firms gained influence without passing new laws. The costs were harder to see. Smaller domestic companies locked out of compute access paid them. Workers whose productivity depended on tools they could not inspect paid them. Citizens whose data became leverage in disputes they never approved paid them. So when Canada invests in domestic AI firms and builds sovereign cloud capacity, this is not anti-tech. It is a correction. It says innovation does not require giving up control. It says public investment can shape markets instead of simply feeding monopolies. And it reveals how fragile the old narrative always was. If borders truly did not matter, Silicon Valley would not be alarmed. If this were only symbolic, markets would not react. The media often misses this because it prefers conflict to structure. It asks whether Washington is angry, whether tech stocks dip, whether leaders trade sharp words. It rarely asks who owns the systems that run daily life or which laws apply when things break. Those questions are harder. They force us to look at how capitalism organizes power, not just returns. The broader lesson is simple and uncomfortable. Digital dependence was never neutral. It was a political and economic choice that favored concentration and weakened democratic control. Canada's decision shows another path exists. It also shows how much resistance appears the moment that path becomes real. Watch how quickly this is labeled protectionism instead of self-determination. Watch how innovation suddenly gets defined as compliance. If you want to understand what comes next, do not just follow the headlines. Ask who controls the servers. Ask whose laws apply when failures happen. Ask why independence in food or energy is praised, but independence in data is treated as extreme. Then ask how many other parts of the economy are quietly arranged the same way. If this helped you see the story beneath the headline, stay engaged. These patterns repeat. They only become visible when we slow down and study the system instead of the noise. Share your thoughts, keep questioning, and stay with me as we continue unpacking how power actually operates in the modern economy. What makes this moment especially revealing is how fast the language shifts once control is challenged. Suddenly you hear that governments should not pick winners, that markets always know best, that innovation needs freedom. But notice how selectively those ideas are applied. When public money built highways, ports, power grids, and the early internet, that was called essential infrastructure. When public money builds domestic AI capacity, it is called interference. That contrast tells you exactly whose interests are being defended. Look at how this plays out on the ground. If you are a Canadian startup trying to train a large model, access to compute is not theoretical. It determines whether you can exist at all. Under the old model, you rented capacity from global platforms that set prices, change terms, and can cut access during a policy shift or geopolitical conflict. Under a sovereign system, compute starts to resemble a public utility, still commercial, still competitive, but anchored in national priorities instead of foreign balance sheets. This is why partnerships with firms like Cohere matter, not because one company saves the system, but because the ecosystem shifts when domestic firms are no longer structurally dependent on foreign infrastructure. Talent stays, research circulates locally, benefits flow to universities, hospitals, and public agencies instead of being pulled upward into global platforms accountable mainly to shareholders. You can also see why companies like Google and Meta react so strongly. Their dominance depends not only on product quality, but on being the default. When countries stop defaulting, inevitability fades. This is not about banning anyone. It is about refusing to outsource the core nervous system of the economy. There is also a class dimension that rarely gets attention. Data sovereignty is worker sovereignty. When algorithms control scheduling, evaluation, credit, insurance, and access to services, the rules inside those systems shape lives directly. If those systems are built and governed elsewhere, democratic input weakens. Decisions appear technical, even though their effects are deeply political. Sovereign infrastructure does not guarantee fairness, but it makes accountability possible. Economists like Jeffrey Sachs have long argued that markets need institutions if they are to serve society rather than hollow it out. This is one of those moments where that idea stops being abstract and becomes real. The real decision is not innovation versus regulation. It is about the kind of innovation you choose. One path increases reliance, the other builds strength. One pulls power inward, the other spreads it out. Pay attention to how financial news covers the aftermath. Market swings become the headline. Investor mood is treated as the scoreboard. What gets ignored is durability over time. A nation that lacks control over its digital backbone faces risks that never appear in earnings reports. Canada is wagering that long-term stability matters more than keeping powerful actors comfortable. That does not mean this path will be easy. Creating local capacity costs real money. Policy errors are inevitable. Lobbying pressure will push to soften rules in the name of competition. That is exactly why public scrutiny matters. Sovereignty is not a single decision. It is an ongoing effort that demands oversight, openness, and participation. So when critics label this anti-business or anti-American, stop and think. Ask which businesses are being protected and who truly benefits. Ask why independence is praised in some industries and discouraged in others. Ask why the digital economy is treated as exempt from principles applied everywhere else. If this feels larger than one country, it is because it is. Other governments are watching closely. Precedents shape behavior. The issue is no longer whether digital borders exist, but who defines them and why. Keep that in mind as events unfold, because the next moves will reveal how power responds when its assumptions are challenged. There is also a geopolitical layer that deserves close attention, because this is where the tension really comes from. For decades, the United States gained from a tight link between corporate reach and state influence. when American companies dominated key sectors. That dominance quietly extended national power without formal agreements or military force. Data became a new territory and corporations became its administrators. Canada's move disrupts that structure in a way trade measures never could. Think about the mechanics. When public institutions, researchers, and firms depend on foreign platforms, they also accept foreign rules. Standards for risk, moderation, storage, and algorithms are decided elsewhere. Even with good intentions, the result is built-in reliance. Over time, local capability weakens, not because talent disappears, but because the system rewards handing off control. Rebuilding later becomes harder and more costly, which explains why dependency is so profitable for those at the center. This is where media framing becomes actively distorted. The story is told as if Canada suddenly chose isolation. In reality, it remains engaged in global research, trade, and innovation. What it rejects is one-sided exposure. Openness is not the same as vulnerability, but dominant narratives blur that line on purpose. The same logic appears across modern economies. When nations talk about food or energy security, the reasoning is obvious. No one argues that total reliance on foreign supply is wise if it leaves you open to pressure. Digital infrastructure, however, was treated as different. We were told software was neutral, servers apolitical, and sovereignty obsolete. That claim only held while power went unchallenged. For everyday people, this can sound abstract, but the effects are concrete. When public data is governed locally, there is at least a route for democratic oversight. Privacy can be enforced, bias can be questioned, procurement can be debated. When data falls under another legal system, those routes narrow. Rights may exist on paper, but using them becomes slower, harder, and less transparent. There's also a labor side that rarely gets attention. High-skill tech work clusters where infrastructure is rooted. If advanced compute sits elsewhere, bargaining power follows it. Workers turn into mobile resources instead of contributors to a national strategy. By investing in domestic AI systems, Canada is not only retaining data, it is shaping where talent can grow without leaving the country or deferring to foreign platforms. Critics argue this creates inefficiency. And yes, redundancy has costs, but narrowly defined efficiency often hides fragility. The cheapest system is rarely the most resilient. The most centralized structure is rarely the most democratic. Markets left alone optimize for returns, not stability or fairness. That is why public action exists. What we are witnessing is a struggle over who sets the rules of the digital economy. Is it corporate governance driven by shareholder value or public governance shaped by social goals? Canada's decision does not settle that conflict, but it makes it visible. And visibility is dangerous for systems that depend on inevitability to survive. So the next time this is dismissed as another regulatory dispute, remember what is truly at stake. This is about whether societies can regain control over the systems that organize daily life. It is about whether democracy can function when its tools are owned and governed elsewhere. It is about whether the future is something we rent or something we build collectively. As this continues, watch not only the policies, but the reactions they trigger. Panic is often the clearest sign that a boundary has been crossed. What makes this moment especially revealing is how quickly the language shifts. Market arguments give way to alarm. Suddenly we hear warnings about fragmentation, waste, and the danger of governments asserting authority over digital systems. Yet one question is never raised. Was it healthy for so much of the world's data to sit under the control of a few firms tied to a single legal system? Did that concentration distort innovation itself? That arrangement was treated as normal only because it served those with the loudest voices. Canada's move exposes a deeper reality of digital capitalism. Control over infrastructure matters more than control over products. Apps can be built by anyone. Very few actors decide where data resides, how it is processed, and when it can be accessed. That foundational layer is where power accumulates. It shapes markets before competition even begins. By investing in sovereign compute and cloud systems, Canada is acting at that base layer, not at the surface where competition stories usually focus. It is easy to see why incumbents are unsettled. If others follow, the global tech landscape begins to resemble a network of negotiated spaces rather than a single dominant center. That weakens any one group's ability to dictate terms. It also disrupts financial expectations built on endless expansion without friction. Growth models based on unrestricted extraction begin to strain once sovereignty returns to the equation. There is also a subtle ideological shift underway. For years, digital policy was framed as technical territory best left to specialists and executives. Canada is asserting that these choices are political because their outcomes shape society. Who owns compute affects who gains from productivity. Who governs data affects whose rights matter when systems fail. This is not anti-market thinking. It starts from an obvious reality. Markets never exist on their own. They sit inside rules, and someone always decides those rules. People feel the impact of these decisions even if they never see a data center or open a policy file. When public services depend on closed systems run from elsewhere, accountability weakens when mistakes occur. Blame spreads out. Responsibility becomes unclear. When prices rise or access changes, options are limited. Local governance does not magically fix this, but it shortens the distance between decision and consequence, which matters for democracy, not as theory, but as a real tool for correction. The backlash also exposes how thin the promise of global tech leadership truly is. If leadership only works when others never assert autonomy, it is not leadership. It is managing dependence. Canada's approach challenges the belief that innovation must flow toward one dominant center. It shows that innovation can exist in many forms, shaped by context and local priorities, without turning inward or cutting ties. None of this guarantees a positive outcome. Sovereignty can be abused, public funding can be captured, standards can be weakened under pressure. That is why the story does not stop with a policy announcement. It continues in how institutions are built, who has influence, and whether public interest is protected over time. Power does not vanish when reclaimed. It simply moves. What matters now is whether people grasp what this moment represents. If it is dismissed as a trade fight or a nationalist gesture, the meaning is lost. But if it is seen as a structural reset, it becomes a marker. It shows that digital capitalism is not inevitable. It is shaped by choices, incentives, and willingness to act. As this unfolds, keep asking the uncomfortable questions. Who controls the systems you rely on every day? Which laws govern them? And what would real accountability look like in a digital economy that claims to serve the public? This moment also forces us to confront a habit built over decades, treating private corporate capacity as a stand-in for public strategy. When governments stop planning, corporations do not fill a neutral gap. They plan for themselves. Their priorities follow profit, market control, and risk avoidance, not long-term social stability. For a while, this can look efficient. Eventually, the cost appears. In the digital economy, that cost shows up as fragility. A single boardroom decision can affect millions of workers overnight. A geopolitical conflict can push essential services into legal uncertainty. A pricing shift can decide which research survives and which ends. None of this requires bad intent. It is the predictable result of systems that shape daily life being governed by incentives never meant to serve the public. Canada's move is a reminder that other paths exist, but also that those paths demand resolve. It is easier to let momentum continue. It is easier to say global platforms are too large to challenge, too efficient to replace, too embedded to rethink. That logic reinforces itself. The longer reliance continues, the harder it becomes to break. Interrupting that cycle early is costly, controversial, and politically risky. That is exactly why so few governments attempt it. What sets this moment apart is timing. Artificial intelligence is still developing. Rules are not fixed. Standards remain unsettled. Governance models are still contested. Choices made now will shape advantages and weaknesses for decades. Waiting until everything feels stable would mean accepting a future designed elsewhere. Acting now means accepting uncertainty in exchange for control. For most people, the impact will not feel dramatic at first. Daily routines will not change overnight, but the effects build over time. Local companies gain space to grow. Public institutions gain leverage in contracts and oversight. Workers gain negotiating power when alternatives exist. Citizens gain a clearer link between policy decisions and real outcomes. These shifts are quiet, but they accumulate. That is also why the backlash is predictable. When power structures are challenged at their foundation, the response is rarely calm discussion. It is anxiety framed as principle. Sudden concern for efficiency, innovation, and openness comes from actors who benefited from closed and concentrated systems. This pattern repeats across industries and across history. The uncomfortable reality is that many democracies drifted into digital dependence because the costs were hidden and the gains were concentrated. Low prices masked long-term risk. Convenience replaced governance. Canada's decision disrupts that balance, not by rejecting technology, but by insisting that technology operate within democratic boundaries rather than above them.